Welcome to Chapter 11. We next move on to the whole notion of pushing exports, that is, of trying to obtain growth through expanding one's export sector. And when countries try and push their own product abroad, often by artificially lowering the price for that product compared to the international competition, that is known as dumping. And according to the World Trade Organization, dumping occurs when goods are exported at a price less than their normal value, whatever that is, generally meaning they are exported for less than they are sold in the domestic market or third country markets, or at less than full production cost. So there is a way to try and benchmark prices for dumping, but you can see it's not easy. It's not an easy task. You have to look at, things like exchange rates as well and all that, and also the foreign market conditions as well. If it's very competitive in the market that you're trying to sell into, then obviously selling at a lower price in that market compared to the price that you're selling the product for domestically, would make sense. So accusations of dumping tend to fly between countries. So there are two legal definitions of normal value. Price-based dumping occurs when a firm sells a product in a foreign market at a price below that for which the firm sells the same product in the domestic market. It is international price discrimination favouring buyers of exports. So in other words, if there's a meaningful difference between the price that you sell it at home for and the price that you sell it abroad for. And then there's cost-based dumping occurs when a firm sells the same good in a foreign market at a price below its average total cost. So you do get dumping where you find that firms are trying to expand their market share and they're willing to sell the product at below even cost, the cost of producing it in the domestic market. So, why do firms do this? So there are two reasons. First of all, predatory dumping. A firm temporarily charges a low price in the foreign export market to basically drive foreign competition out of business, acquire greater market share in that particular country. Cyclical dumping. This occurs because during a period of economic recession. Because of low demand, the firm tends to lower its price to limit the decline in quantity sold. During a recession with falling demand, the market price may fall below the average total cost, but above the average variable cost. That is the cost of just producing each unit, so without the fixed costs. The average variable costs only cover part of the fixed cost of production. So the firm will continue to produce as long as the price exceeds that average variable cost. In other words, the cost of producing an extra one, but without the overhead for the fixed costs that the firm has to carry. The firm is going to continue to produce as long as it meets those costs. In other words, the costs of, if you like, producing usually an additional unit of the product. Seasonal dumping. I didn't know about these ones, so I'm sorry, I thought there were just two reasons. But seasonal dumping, a firm exports excess inventories of a product. A price above the marginal cost of making the sale is sensible. This is similar to the introductory low price that an exporting firm often uses to establish its product in the new foreign market. And then persistent dumping, a firm with market power that uses international price discrimination between domestic and foreign markets. In other words, here, this is where a firm will be trying to really gain a solid market share in the foreign country. With persistent dumping, as a general rule, a profit-maximizing firm with monopoly power will charge a lower price to foreign buyers if it has less monopoly power, so if there's more competition in that foreign country, or it has more elastic demand, or it faces more elastic demand in that foreign country than it has in its home market, or if buyers in the home country cannot avoid the high home prices by buying the good abroad and importing it cheaply. So if there are restrictions, for whatever reason, and for whatever type, on importing into the home country. So let's have a look and see how this works. Now, I don't know if you're all familiar with the monopoly diagram on the left. You can see the demand curve there, and this is a Japanese firm, and this is a firm selling phones. Think of Sony, for example. For a monopolist, they always set marginal revenue equals marginal cost, because that's the profit maximizing level for any firm. Hopefully you did that in your foundations of economics. Then, so once it's set that determines the quantity, so it's going to produce 100. Now remember, this is a monopolist, so it doesn't face any competition whatsoever. If it faced competition, of course, it would produce at the average cost, so down at 18. But it doesn't face any competition, so it's going to maximize profits, and that means marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And it basically looks at how much the demand curve says that it can charge for the product, given that it's going to produce 100, and it tracks that up to the demand curve, so it dictates a price of $60 in the home market. That means the company makes a profit of course, the excess of 60 over 18, which in this case is going to be 42, and times the number of units produced, so 100. So it would be 42 times 100 for the profit. Looking at the right-hand side, here Sony is exporting the phone to the US. Now notice that the demand curve in the US is a lot flatter, and there's competition there. So in this case, the firm is going to choose marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Its marginal cost is the same as its average cost, which is 18, so same thing as per in Japan. But look at where its marginal revenue is now. It's a lot flatter. You track that up to the demand curve, so it's going to produce 150 for the US, and it's only going to be able to charge 25. So in other words, this is an example where in the left-hand side of the diagram you have a monopoly. In the right-hand side of the diagram you have a much flatter demand curve, a more elastic demand curve. Hence, the price that the firm concerned can charge, say it's Sony, I don't know whether it actually is Sony, I'm just giving an example of a Japanese phone producer, because there are not many. But in this case, it would make business sense for Sony to be producing or charging less in that foreign market. And here you have this described. In other words, we have so-called price discrimination. And you can see, that's possible only because Japan has very strict import controls. And we talked about those in relation to non-tariff barriers in a previous chapter. But Japan basically says that cell phones sold in, or said at one point that cell phones sold in Japan had to be have specific specs, so specifications. And Apple at the time didn't meet those. So basically it was very difficult for Japanese consumers to actually buy anything other than Sony at any reasonable price. If they wanted to purchase an iPhone or for example, they would have to pay a much higher price. So that allows the well, they wouldn't be able to actually buy an iPhone, but now they can. But Japan has quite heavy import tariffs on things like phones. So it's still, what I said still stands. It's much more expensive to buy an iPhone than a Sony in Japan. And the price discrimination is viable there because, consumers in Japan find it difficult to get hold of iPhones at a reasonable cost. And to be able to, and even if they can, in Japan you've got to specify what phone you're using on the system. You can't just bring your own phone and any provider will just plug you in. From my recollection, you've got to specify what phone you're using, and that goes on your record kind of thing. So it's difficult to then start using a foreign phone, or it was. So what's the reaction to dumping? What should a dumpee think? So the firm that's having its market dumped into, if you like. So the optimal response to dumping will depend on the type of dumping, whether it's predatory, cyclical, seasonal, or persistent. So dumping is usually good for the country importing the dumped exports, but two types of dumping could be harmful for the importing country. Predatory dumping can be bad when it is successful, but that's probably going to be rare. So in other words, when a company does charge a lower price as a predatory measure. Cyclical dumping can be harmful as well, importing unemployment in other words, but much of the time it's just part of the industry cycle in competitive markets. So in other words here it might be due to recession, so therefore that's cyclical dumping, so therefore the company is trying to sell off some of the product abroad where it perceives the market may be stronger than at home. So, what are the actual anti-dumping policies out there, and what's unfair? Well, WTO rules permit countries to retaliate against dumping if that dumping injures domestic import competing producers. So if the government in the importing country finds both dumping and injury, in other words, a domestic firm is hurt, the government is permitted to impose an anti-dumping duty. So that's like a tariff against that firm that's trying to dump their product in your country. So an extra tariff equal to the discrepancy, the dumping margin between the actual export price and the normal value. Under current anti-dumping policies, we get the following results. The procedure is biased towards finding dumping. So in other words, it's quite easy to show that prices are different in different countries, and that can often substantiate the WTO saying that countervailing tariffs can be applied. And the injury test considers only harm to import competing producers. There's no consideration of whether the predation or some other source of harm is involved, or are the benefits to consumers of the lower priced imports. So it's just whether the import competing industries are harmed. So that's obviously going to be more likely to be an answer of yes. The process is therefore biased towards imposing anti-dumping duties, generally lowering the well-being of the importing country, particularly the consumers in that importing country, and also world welfare because of the retaliation that's allowed in terms of tariffs. So he makes three proposals for reform. Limit anti-dumping actions to situations in which predatory dumping is plausible. Focus on the type of dumping that is most likely to be bad for the world and for the importing country. 2, expand the injury standards to require that full weight be given to consumers and users of the product. Shift to injury to net national well-being. So in other words, is that import of that lower price good? Is it in the national interest? So you've got to not just take the fact that domestic firms might be hurt, but the consumers could gain from that. Replace anti-dumping policy with safeguard policy, another kind of increased temporary import protection allowed by WTO rules to safeguard an industry, for example. So safeguard policy is better because there's no need to show that foreign exporters have done anything unfair. The interests of consumers can be considered in the process that leads to the decision of whether or not to impose a safeguard policy. And the focus is on providing time for adjustment by the importing competing firms and their workers. There's pressure to adjust because the import protection is temporary. Now, what about export subsidies? Well, we're going to consider that in the second half of this chapter and put it into a separate video. Thank you.